Imagine walking down the aisle, the cameras flashing, with everyone believing you are the luckiest woman in the world. But as you collapse at the altar, the bridal makeup washes away, revealing a dark, terrifying secret of abuse. That is exactly what happened to Elena. What the mafia boss discovered beneath her veil didn't just expose her groom's hidden monster. It started a quiet revolution of power and self-discovery. Why, Balmay, did a fragile bride choose to tear up her flight ticket to safety and stand up against a powerful state senator? Welcome to our channel. This space is dedicated to the world of mafia bosses, where some are born to rule. We explore lessons that the school of life never teaches you. Secrets only the true kingpins know. We do not tell basic crime stories. We explore the mindset, the raw bravery, and the hidden mechanisms behind real power and influence. The story of Elena and Victor teaches us that true resilience isn't about hiding our scars beneath a flawless mask. It is about finding the courage to expose them and turning our darkest moments into our greatest strength. If you value stories about true grit, human respect, and the power of redemption, please hit that like button, leave a comment below with your thoughts, share this video with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful journeys.
St. Jude's Cathedral in downtown Chicago was an architectural masterpiece of vaulted limestone, soaring Gothic arches, and 15th-century stained glass imported from Europe. On this particular evening, however, the hallowed space felt less like a sanctuary and more like a gilded cage. The air was thick and suffocating, heavy with the cloying scent of white lilies, expensive French perfume, and the sharp metallic tang of hidden tension. Hundreds of guests filled the pews, a carefully curated mosaic of Chicago's high society and the shadowy, untouchable figures of the criminal underworld. Judges, senators, and corporate titans sat on the left side of the aisle. Men with cold eyes, immaculate suits, and razor-sharp postures occupied the right. It was an uneasy alliance, a marriage of convenience between the political elite and the city's reigning syndicate. Victor Vance sat in the third row, perfectly centered. At 45, Victor had long outgrown the chaotic, messy street violence that had defined his early years in the Vance family. He ran the syndicate like a multinational corporation, relying on strategy, logistics, and a profound understanding of human nature. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit that sat loosely enough to conceal the weight of a customized sidearm, but sharply enough to command absolute authority. He did not want to be here. Weddings were usually sentimental, fragile things, but this one was a necessary transaction. His presence was a public show of force and an endorsement of the union between State Senator Marcus Thorne and Elena Hayes. Marcus needed the financial backing and the street-level security that only the Vance syndicate could provide. In return, Victor needed Thorne's influence to clear the bureaucratic hurdles blocking the expansion of their shipping ports. It was a business arrangement wrapped in white lace and diamonds. The grand organ notes echoed through the nave, shifting from a soft, classical melody to the heavy, triumphant swell of the bridal march. The massive oak doors at the back of the cathedral swung open, and the crowd collectively turned their heads. Elena Hayes appeared under the stream of golden light pouring through the stained glass windows. She was 38, a woman whose beauty had once been legendary in the upper echelons of Chicago's elite. Tonight, however, she looked like an exquisite ghost. She wore an ivory silk gown that cascaded onto the stone floor, adorned with thousands of hand-stitched pearls. Her dark hair was swept up into an intricate classic chignon, and a sheer veil covered the upper half of her face. But to a man like Victor, who spent his life reading the micro-expressions of men under pressure, the illusion was paper-thin. Elena's walk was not the buoyant, radiant procession of a happy bride. It was the careful, mechanical march of a woman moving toward a silent, predetermined execution. Her shoulders were rigid, locked in place, and as she stepped closer, Victor could see the faint, unnatural stiffness in her posture. Her face was a masterpiece of professional cosmetic artistry. The heavy foundation, the carefully applied powder, and the subtle blush were designed to project an image of pristine perfection. Yet beneath that heavy layer of paint, Victor's keen, unblinking eyes caught a subtle, erratic tremor in her breathing. He noticed the way she avoided looking at the altar, where Senator Marcus Thorne stood waiting with a smile that failed to reach his cold, predatory eyes. Victor watched the distance close. As Elena reached the third pew, where Victor sat observing the room, the air in the cathedral seemed to trap her. The sheer weight of the atmosphere, the heat of the television cameras broadcasting the political union to the nation, and the physical toll of whatever horrors she was hiding seemed to converge on her all at once. Then, the impossible happened. Elena's left foot caught slightly on the hem of her heavy silk gown. It was not a clumsy stumble, but a sudden, complete giving out of her physical strength. Her eyes rolled back, fluttering beneath the veil, and the color drained entirely from her lips. Before any of the bridesmaids could react, Elena collapsed, falling heavily onto the cold marble floor right in front of Victor's pew. The immediate reaction was a wave of synchronized gasps. The distinguished guests in the first few rows stood up, craning their necks, while the photographer's flashes went off in rapid, blinding succession. Victor did not flinch. Acting on the pure, unfiltered instinct of a man who had survived 30 years in the darkest corners of the city, he was out of his seat before the first murmur could spread. He moved with a quiet, terrifying speed, stepping over the velvet rope that separated the guests from the aisle. He knelt on the hard marble, his charcoal suit jacket falling open. With practiced, gentle strength, Victor scooped Elena into his arms, lifting her up from the cold floor. The veil slipped back, and the sudden movement of his hands against her neck and arms disturbed the pristine illusion she had worked so hard to maintain. As his fingers pressed against her skin, he felt the damp, stifling heat of the room mix with the cold sweat on her body. The high-end foundation meant to last through the night began to smear and separate. Victor looked down, and the cold, unfeeling facade he wore cracked. Beneath the heavy, white powder on her neck and the delicate lace of her gown lay a map of horrifying, dark purple contusions. A set of distinct, yellowish-green fingerprints wrapped entirely around her throat, a brutal testament to the violence she had endured behind closed doors. And as her sleeve pulled back slightly near her wrist, it revealed a fresh, jagged burn scar, an injury still weeping beneath the cosmetic camouflage. The silence that fell over the front rows of the cathedral was absolute. The horrific reality of what had been hidden beneath the bride's makeup was now laid bare before the elite of Chicago. Before anyone could process the gravity of the discovery, heavy, expensive leather shoes clicked sharply against the marble. Marcus Thorne, the groom, pushed through the immediate circle of bridesmaids and security personnel. His polished, public-facing facade was rapidly cracking into an ugly, furious sneer. The mask of the honorable state senator was slipping, revealing the tyrant underneath. "What the hell are you doing, Vance?" Marcus barked, his voice vibrating with uncontrolled rage and a desperate need to reclaim control of the narrative. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger at Elena's limp form in Victor's arms. "Put her down immediately. This is a private family matter. The press is watching. Hand her over to me right now." Victor remained on one knee, his arms steadfastly supporting Elena's fragile body against his chest. He did not look up at the senator at first. He looked down at the bruised, pale face of the woman in his arms, feeling the shallow, fragile rhythm of her heartbeat. Then, Victor raised his head. His dark, impenetrable eyes locked onto Marcus Thorne. The air in the cathedral turned frigid. The bodyguard standing behind the senator instinctively took a half-step back, recognizing the shift in the room from a social gathering to a moment of lethal consequence. Victor stood up to his full, imposing height, holding Elena securely against his chest. He towered over the politician, his presence dominating the entire sanctuary. "A man who uses his fists on a woman to establish authority isn't strong," Victor said. His voice was not loud, but it possessed a terrifying, resonant weight that carried through the vaulted ceiling, loud enough for the reporters in the front rows to hear every syllable. "He's a coward desperately trying to hide his own pathetic weakness." Basic human respect is the last remaining line between us and animals, Marcus, and today you crossed it. The color completely drained from Thorne's face. The senator opened his mouth to shout an order to his men, but the absolute stillness of the Vance syndicate members stationed throughout the cathedral made it clear that any sudden movement would be his last. "Take care of the press," Victor said over his shoulder to one of his trusted capos, never breaking eye contact with the politician. "And call the estate doctor, now." With a swift, calculated turn of his body, Victor walked down the main aisle, carrying Elena out of the cathedral. The heavy oak doors swung open to the cool evening air of Chicago, leaving the high society and the exposed senator in stunned, irrevocable silence. The veil of the counterfeit wedding had been torn away, and the game had officially begun. The estate of the Vance family did not feel like the headquarters of an organized crime syndicate. It felt like an impenetrable fortress designed by an eccentric historian. Situated on the heavily wooded bluffs overlooking Lake Michigan, the sprawling limestone manor was a testament to old money permanence. Thick, ivy-draped walls insulated the estate from the chaos of the city, and the only sound that ever penetrated the heavy glass windows was the distant, rhythmic crash of the lake against the rocky shoreline. Elena Hayes opened her eyes slowly. The ceiling above her was a breathtaking expanse of hand-painted frescoes depicting the golden age of Florentine architecture. The room was vast, draped in heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the harsh afternoon light, leaving the space illuminated only by the warm, flickering glow of a marble fireplace. She bolted upright, a sharp gasp escaping her dry throat as the memories of the last 24 hours rushed back in a violent wave. The suffocating scent of the cathedral, the blinding flash of the cameras, the crushing weight of the ivory gown, and the terrifying moment her strength had given out beneath the weight of her own terror. She looked down at her hands. The bridal gown had been removed. In its place, she wore a soft, high-necked silk cashmere robe, far too large for her frame, its deep charcoal color contrasting sharply with her pale, fragile skin. Her right wrist was heavily wrapped in pristine white gauze, and a dull, throbbing ache radiated from the burn scar on her forearm. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her chest. Her brother. Where was Leo? Marcus had him. The senator had made it explicitly clear that if Elena ever attempted to run, or if she failed to play the part of the devoted, obedient fiancé during the wedding, her brother would pay the ultimate price. Elena threw the heavy woolen blankets aside and swung her legs over the edge of the oversized mahogany bed. Her bare feet hit the cold, polished hardwood floor, sending a shiver through her spine. She took 3 steps toward the heavy double doors of the bedroom before the room seemed to tilt dangerously around her. She caught herself on the edge of a heavy oak dresser, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. "I wouldn't recommend standing just yet, Mrs. Thorne, or perhaps I should say Miss Hayes." The voice was low, smooth, and laced with an unshakable calm that cut through the silence of the room. Elena whirled around, her hand flying to her throat, a defensive reflex that only caused her to wince as the movement pulled at her bruised neck. Victor Vance was sitting in a high-backed leather wing chair near the fireplace, partially obscured by the shadows. He was dressed in a simple, dark cashmere sweater, his sleeves pushed up to the forearms, revealing a thick gold watch and a series of faint, faded scars that mapped his knuckles. In his hand, he held a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid, the ice clinking softly against the glass. "Where is my brother?" Elena demanded, her voice hoarse, trembling, but fierce with protective instinct. She didn't care that she was in a stranger's territory. She didn't care that this man was the most powerful and feared syndicate boss in the Midwest. She only cared about the boy who had kept her alive through years of darkness. Victor did not move. He took a slow, measured sip of his drink, his dark, impenetrable eyes fixed on her. The silence stretched between them, heavy and weighted, until Elena felt the urge to scream, just to break the tension. "He is safe, Ms. Hayes," Victor said finally, his tone even. "He is currently located at one of my secondary properties in Wisconsin. He has a warm bed, 3 square meals, and a detail of 4 armed men outside his door. He is out of Marcus Thorne's reach. And more importantly, he is out of yours, until we dismantle the man who put him there. Elena stared at him, her chest heaving as she tried to process the information. The fear that had been her constant companion for years made it difficult to trust anyone, let alone a mafia boss. Why would you do that? You don't know me. You don't know Leo. What is the price for this? I have no money left. Marcus took everything, including the trust fund my father left us. Victor set his crystal tumbler down on the small side table with a faint, sharp click. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze piercing through the dim light of the room. Let us be very clear about the nature of our arrangement, Elena, Victor said, using her first name with a casual familiarity that sent a shiver down her spine. I did not save you and your brother out of charity. I am not a knight in shining armor. I am a businessman. When Marcus Thorne stood at the altar, he was attempting to use your family's name and your father's legacy to legitimize his campaign for the governor's office. He was also attempting to use my syndicate as the muscle to secure his political future while simultaneously attempting to double-cross my shipping lanes. He stood up, his tall, imposing figure casting a long shadow against the limestone wall as he walked slowly toward the fireplace. But when you collapsed, Victor continued, his voice dropping an octave, and the foundation washed away, I saw something that changed the parameters of our agreement. I saw a man who believes that power gives him the right to crush the weak. I do not tolerate domestic violence in my presence, let alone in my business partnerships. And I certainly do not tolerate men who use terror as a tool of governance. Elena crossed her arms tightly over her chest, the charcoal cashmere fabric bunching up in her small fists. You don't understand the reach he has. He has the police in his pocket. He has judges who owe him favors. If you keep me here, he will turn the entire city upside down. He will come for you, and he will kill my brother just to punish me for running away. Victor stopped just a few feet away from her. He towered over her, yet he kept a respectful distance, his posture defensive rather than aggressive. Let me teach you something about the people who hold true power, Elena, Victor said, his dark eyes studying every line of her face. Running only excites the hunter. When you turn your back and try to flee from a predator, you hand them the advantage. You hand them the whip. He took a step closer, his voice low, firm, and resonant. True wisdom isn't about running from the whip, Elena. It is about learning to use your enemy's own shadow to flip the board. You have spent years hiding beneath layers of foundation, pretending that perfection would save you from his brutality. It didn't. Perfection only made you a more valuable trophy in his collection. Elena looked down at the floor, the truth of his words cutting through her defensive walls. She had tried to be perfect. She had endured the beatings, the threats, and the isolation, all to protect Leo. And what had it gotten her? A silver cage and a wedding dress that felt like a burial shroud. Then what do we do? Elena whispered, the fight draining from her voice, replaced by a cold, desperate resolve. He is too powerful. We can't just fight him in the streets. Victor turned toward the heavy mahogany door, his hand resting on the brass handle. He looked back over his shoulder, a faint, cold smile touching the corners of his mouth. We don't fight him in the streets, Victor replied smoothly. We fight him in the ledger, in the courts, and in the dark spaces where his political allies can't reach him. But before we do any of that, you need to eat and you need to rest. He pulled the door open, signaling to someone outside. A moment later, a quiet, middle-aged woman in a maid's uniform entered, carrying a silver tray laden with hot broth, fresh bread, and a pot of strong black coffee. Sit down and eat, Victor commanded softly before stepping out of the room. We have a long and very difficult road ahead of us, Ms. Hayes, and I need you to be strong enough to walk it. The morning sun broke over the Chicago skyline, casting long, sharp shadows across the panoramic windows of Victor Vance's private study. The room was lined from floor to ceiling with leather-bound books, vintage maritime maps, and heavy oak filing cabinets. But this morning, the serene atmosphere of the study was pierced by the sharp, angry tone of the men gathered around the large mahogany desk. Victor sat behind the desk, his hands steepled in front of his face, listening to Frank Moretti, his senior advisor and the man who had managed the syndicate's finances for over 20 years, pace the Persian rug. "It's a logistical nightmare, Victor," Frank said, running a hand through his thinning gray hair. "The Thorn campaign has already filed an emergency injunction against our shipping ports in the South Side. They are claiming we are harboring a missing person, the future governor's wife no less. The police are preparing to raid the secondary warehouses by tomorrow afternoon if we don't produce Elena Hayes." Victor did not move. He continued to look at a detailed financial ledger spread out on the desk, his expression unreadable. "Let them file the injunction. It's a publicity stunt designed to force my hand before the upcoming polls." "But that isn't all," Frank said, stopping his pacing to lean over the desk. "The capos from the Little Italy faction are getting nervous. They think we're bringing unnecessary heat upon the family for a woman who doesn't belong to the syndicate. They are whispering that you're letting personal feelings interfere with business. You know how they are, Victor. They don't care about a politician's wife. They care about the bottom line." Victor closed the ledger with a soft, deliberate thud. He looked up, his dark eyes locking onto the older man's face, and the silence in the room became absolute. "Let them whisper," Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "and tell the capos that the moment we begin handing over people who seek our protection, we lose our standing in this city. A Vance does not bow to a politician who can't even keep his own house in order. Marcus Thorne is using the police as his personal security detail. It is a misuse of state funds, and we will use that very fact to expose him." Frank let out a long, weary sigh. "I understand your point, Victor. I really do. But what about the girl? Is she going to be a liability to us? She has been living in the guest suite for 3 days now, and she looks like she might break if you touch her." "She is not a liability, Frank," Victor said, his voice softening just enough to show his authority on the matter. "She is the only person who knows where the senator's offshore accounts are registered. She was the one who managed his personal philanthropic funds before the wedding. She knows where the bodies are buried." As Victor finished his sentence, a soft knock sounded at the heavy wooden door. It swung open, revealing Elena. She was dressed in a simple charcoal gray wool sweater and black trousers that Victor had instructed his staff to provide for her. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and though the dark circles under her eyes were still visible, the terrified, hunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steely determination. She had washed her face clean of the heavy, white powder, revealing the pale skin and the faint, yellowish bruises on her jawline. Frank looked at her, then back at Victor, before clearing his throat awkwardly and stepping back into the shadows of the room. "Excuse me," Elena said, her voice steady, though her hands, clutching a thick manila folder, trembled slightly. "I heard my name mentioned. I came to give you this." She walked toward the desk and placed the folder squarely in front of Victor. The manila folder was thick, packed with old banking statements, handwritten notes, and printouts of encrypted digital transfers. "What is this?" Victor asked, opening the folder and scanning the first few pages with keen interest. "This is the shadow ledger," Elena said, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. She pulled out a chair and sat down without being asked, her posture upright and defiant. "For the past 3 years, Marcus has been using the campaign funds to finance private security firms in South America and to pay off the state inspectors who oversee the construction of his real estate projects. These documents link his shell companies directly to the accounts used to bribe the city council members." Victor looked up from the documents, a faint, appreciative smile touching his lips. He leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat on the armrest. "This is a masterpiece, Elena. Where did you get this?" "I was his accountant before I was his fiancée," Elena said, her voice turning cold as ice. "He thought I was just a naive girl from a fallen family who would do whatever he asked to keep my brother alive. He didn't know I kept copies of everything. Every wire transfer, every shell corporation, every bribe. I knew this day would come." She leaned forward, her dark eyes meeting Victor's. "But there is something you need to know." He has a backup server located at his private estate in the suburbs. If the federal authorities get their hands on it before we release this data, he will wipe these accounts clean and frame me for the embezzlement. Frank stepped forward, his eyes wide with surprise as he looked at the documents on the desk. Victor, if this is true, we can take the governor's office down before the election even begins, but we'll need an army to get into the private estate. Thorne has at least 20 armed guards on the property 24 hours a day. Before Victor could answer, the heavy double doors of the study flew open. One of the syndicate's lieutenants burst into the room, his breathing ragged and his suit jacket disheveled. "Boss, we have a problem," the lieutenant said, wiping a line of sweat from his forehead. "A police cruiser just pulled up to the front gates. 2 detectives are demanding to see you and Ms. Hayes. They have an arrest warrant for Elena, signed by Judge Reynolds, one of Thorne's closest friends. They say she is wanted for questioning regarding the embezzlement of the senator's campaign fund." The atmosphere in the study turned frigid. Frank cursed softly under his breath, while Elena's face lost all its color. Her hands, resting on the desk, began to shake uncontrollably. "They found us," Elena whispered, the old fear creeping back into her voice like a dark tide. "He used the police to find me. If I go with them, I'll never see my brother again. He'll have me killed in the holding cell." Victor stood up, his presence instantly filling the room and silencing the panic that was beginning to rise among the men. He walked around the desk, his charcoal suit jacket falling perfectly over his shoulders, and placed a firm, reassuring hand on Elena's shoulder. The touch was steady, warm, and electric. "Sit down, Elena," Victor said, his voice calm, even, and resonant. "You are in my house, and nobody takes anyone from this house without my permission." He turned to the lieutenant, his dark eyes cold and calculating. "Tell the detectives that Ms. Hayes is currently unavailable and that my legal team is reviewing the warrant. Let them wait at the gate for half an hour. Then, call the capos from the Little Italy faction. Tell them that the time has come to show the senator what happens when he brings the state's police to the Vance family's door." The lieutenant nodded sharply and turned on his heel, leaving the study with a renewed sense of urgency. Frank looked at Victor, his face lined with deep concern. "Victor, if we turn them away by force, we are entering a direct war with the state of Illinois. It's no longer just a business dispute. It's a direct challenge to the government." Victor walked back to his desk and picked up the manila folder that Elena had brought him. He held it up to the light of the morning sun, his eyes reflecting the sharp golden rays. "Let them challenge us," Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, firm growl. He looked directly at Elena, his gaze locking into hers to deliver a message that she would remember for the rest of her life. The grandfather clock in the grand hallway of the Vance estate struck midnight, its deep, resonant chimes echoing through the silent limestone corridors. Outside, the autumn wind whipped off Lake Michigan, rattling the heavy, reinforced glass of the study windows. Inside, the room was bathed in the warm, golden glow of a Tiffany lamp, casting long shadows across the Persian rug. Elena sat at the large mahogany desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard of a secure, encrypted laptop that Victor had provided for her. The manila folder she had brought days ago was now spread out in pieces across the desk, its contents digitized and cross-referenced with the syndicate's own intelligence files. She had spent the last 72 hours in a state of hyper-focus, drinking cup after cup of black coffee, driven by the singular, burning desire to dismantle the man who had controlled her life for a decade. She paused, her hands trembling slightly as a wave of exhaustion washed over her. She reached up, her fingertips tracing the faint, yellowish bruises along her jawline. The heavy foundation, the contouring, and the cosmetic camouflage she had worn for years were completely gone now. For the first time since she was 28, she was not hiding beneath the synthetic armor of flawless makeup. Her face was bare, revealing the pale skin, the slight hollows of her cheeks, and the small, jagged scar near her temple, a reminder of a fall down the stairs during an argument with Marcus 2 winters ago. "You're pushing yourself too hard, Elena." The voice came from the doorway. Victor was leaning against the heavy oak frame, his charcoal suit jacket discarded, wearing only a crisp white dress shirt with the top two buttons undone. He held two crystal glasses filled with an amber liquid, the ice melting slowly against the glass. Elena started, her dark eyes flashing up to meet his. She let out a soft breath, relaxing her tense shoulders. I can't sleep, Victor. Every time I close my eyes, I see the way Marcus looked at the cathedral. I see his smile, and I remember the nights when he would lock me in the basement because I questioned where his donations were coming from. Victor walked across the quiet room, his soft leather shoes making no sound on the rug, and set one of the glasses down beside her laptop. The scent of aged bourbon filled the air, sharp and grounding. It is difficult to unlearn the habits of survival, Victor said softly, pulling up a heavy leather chair and sitting directly across from her. He leaned forward, his dark eyes studying every line of her bare face. When you have lived in a cage for years, the open door feels more terrifying than the lock. But you are not in that cage anymore. Elena picked up the glass, letting the warmth of the alcohol spread through her chest. She took a small sip and looked away, staring into the dark reflection of the window. I thought I was being smart, you know. I thought that if I became the perfect wife, if I learned the politics, if I raised the money, if I made myself indispensable to his career, he would eventually stop treating me like a possession. I thought that love or respect could be earned through obedience. Victor shook his head, his expression hardening as he listened to the lingering pain in her voice. He leaned in, his gaze burning with an intensity that demanded her full attention. Obedience only breeds contempt in men like Marcus, Victor said, his voice low, firm, and resonant. Perfection is an illusion that predators use to keep their prey from fighting back. Genuine human connection, the kind that gives us strength in the darkest of times, only begins when we dare to expose our darkest, most shattered pieces without the fear of judgment. He reached across the desk and gently took the glass from her hand, setting it aside. He didn't break eye contact. You do not have to hide your scars from me, Elena, Victor said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a low, gravelly whisper. I have seen the worst that this city has to offer. I have seen men torn apart by greed and destroyed by their own ambition. Your scars are not a sign of weakness. They are the map of a survivor. They are the proof that you stood against a monster and lived to tell the tale. Elena swallowed hard, a lump forming in her throat. She looked down at her hands, the thick white gauze covering the burn scar on her right wrist. I was so afraid that if he found me, he would kill Leo. That's why I agreed to the wedding. That's why I let him put the ring on my finger. And that is why he lost, Victor replied without hesitation. He underestimated the one thing he could not control. The love you have for your brother, and the courage it took to collapse at that altar rather than let him destroy your soul. You chose humanity over a lie. The silence returned, but this time it was not heavy or suffocating. It was quiet, intimate, and warm. Elena felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, a feeling she had not known since before her father's empire collapsed. For years, she had been surrounded by men who treated her as an object, a political prop to be displayed or hidden as the situation demanded. Here, in the dark study of the city's most feared syndicate boss, she was seen for the first time as a person. We found the secondary server, Victor said, breaking the quiet after several minutes. He nodded toward the laptop. Frank's men managed to hack into Thorne's private campaign database an hour ago. We have the files. We have the names of the judges he bribed and the real estate developers who funneled foreign money into his super PAC. Elena's eyes widened, the exhaustion instantly forgotten. Are you going to send it to the press? Victor smiled, a cold, sharp, and calculated expression that made him look every bit the powerful kingpin he was. Not yet. A public release right now would only cause the media to spin it as a political dispute between two rivals. The public would forget in 2 weeks. No, Elena. We are going to bleed his support network dry first. We are going to make his allies realize that supporting Marcus Thorne is a financial death sentence. He stood up, towering over the desk, his presence filling the small corner of the study. Tomorrow, Victor said, his tone turning crisp and authoritative, we are going to pay a visit to Richard Sterling, the chairman of the state's central bank, and the man who has been personally laundering Thorne's illicit contributions through the city's municipal bonds. Elena felt a sudden rush of adrenaline. Sterling is a very dangerous man. He has his own private security force, and he never meets anyone without 3 layers of background checks. Then it is a good thing, Victor replied, a dark, dangerous glint in his eyes, that we are not going to ask for a meeting. We are going to remind him that the Vance Syndicate's shipping lanes hold more weight in this city than his municipal bonds. He reached out and closed the laptop, gently touching her chin with his strong, scarred fingers. Go to sleep, Elena, Victor said softly. Tomorrow, you are going to stand by my side and watch the empire you helped build from the shadows come crashing down. The morning air in downtown Chicago was crisp and gray, smelling of rain and asphalt. A fleet of 3 black, heavily tinted Chevrolet Suburbans rolled smoothly past the security gates of the Sterling Financial Building, one of the tallest and most exclusive skyscrapers on Michigan Avenue. The building was a monument to corporate wealth, its glass facade reflecting the murky waters of the Chicago River. Victor Vance sat in the back seat of the middle vehicle, dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal 3-piece suit, his hands resting on the silver head of a heavy walking cane that he sometimes used as a precaution. Beside him sat Elena. She wore a tailored black trench coat and dark sunglasses, her hair pinned back in an elegant, severe bun. Her bare face was striking, the pale, delicate features projecting a cold, regal composure that commanded respect. The building is locked down, Frank Moretti said from the passenger seat, holding an encrypted tablet displaying the security feeds. Sterling's private security detail is positioned on the lobby level and the 42nd floor. They have 5 armed men outside his office. Victor did not look up from his tablet. We are not here to start a war in the middle of the financial district, Frank. We are here to conduct a bloodless purge. Sterling is a businessman first and a politician's puppet second. Show him the ledger, and let the numbers do the talking. Elena turned to look out the window as the car came to a smooth halt beneath the concrete canopy of the building's private garage. The adrenaline of the past few days had sharpened her focus. She knew the stakes. If they failed to neutralize Sterling, Thorne would continue to use the state police to hunt them down. Are you sure this will work, Victor? She asked, her voice low, steady, and devoid of the terror that had once defined her. Sterling is deeply indebted to Marcus's campaign. His own son was bailed out of a federal charge by Thorne's personal intervention 2 years ago. Victor turned to her, his dark eyes softening for a fraction of a second before his unyielding kingpin persona returned. A man who owes his son's freedom to a politician will turn on that politician the moment his own empire is threatened. Sterling loves his money more than he loves Thorne's political career. Watch and learn, Elena. This is how the real game of kings is played. The heavy doors of the Suburban were pulled open by a member of the syndicate's elite security team. Victor stepped out, his presence instantly dominating the dark garage. He moved with a slow, deliberate confidence, his posture straight and his eyes scanning the area with lethal precision. Elena stepped out beside him, her black heels clicking rhythmically against the polished concrete floor. A team of 10 armed men, dressed in simple, dark suits that matched Victor's, fell into a tight diamond formation around them. They bypassed the public elevators entirely, using a private magnetic keycard to access the service elevator that led directly to the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor. The elevator doors chimed and slid open to reveal a spacious, sunlit corridor adorned with expensive modern art and floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a panoramic view of the city. 5 of Sterling's private security guards, dressed in tactical gear with their hands resting on their holstered sidearms, stood in a tight line blocking the glass doors of the executive suite. The leader of the security team, a burly man with a jagged scar across his chin, stepped forward. Private property, Mr. Vance. Mr. Sterling is not receiving guests this morning. You and your people need to leave the premises immediately. Victor did not stop walking. He kept his pace steady, his dark eyes locking onto the leader's face with a calm, terrifying emptiness. The 10 men behind Victor fanned out, their hands falling into their suit jackets, their postures shifting from defensive to lethal. "Tell Richard," Victor said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant register that echoed down the quiet corridor, "that the Vance family does not require an appointment to inspect its own assets." The security guard's hand hovered over his weapon, but the cold, unyielding silence of Victor's team made it clear that a single movement would result in a crossfire. The leader swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the side, before he stepped back and pushed open the massive glass doors of the boardroom. The boardroom was vast, featuring a 30-foot mahogany table surrounded by leather chairs. At the far end, overlooking the lake, sat Richard Sterling, a silver-haired man in his late 60s, dressed in a bespoke Italian suit. He did not look up immediately, but the tremor in his hands as he signed a document betrayed his calm facade. "You are trespassing, Vance," Sterling said coldly, not looking up from his papers. "And you are bringing unnecessary heat to a regulated financial institution. If you think the police will let you walk out of this building, you are mistaken." Victor walked to the center of the mahogany table, pulled out a heavy chair, and sat down. He placed both hands on his walking cane, leaning forward slightly with a predatory grace. "The police are currently outside the Vance estate, Richard," Victor said smoothly, "and they are waiting for a person who isn't there. But we are not here to discuss the police. We are here to discuss your investments." Elena walked forward and stood directly beside Victor's chair. She opened a thin, black leather folder and laid 3 sheets of paper across the mahogany table. Sterling glanced at the papers, and the color instantly drained from his face. His pale blue eyes widened as he read the numbers, the routing codes, and the names of the offshore shell companies highlighted in red ink. "Where did you get this?" Sterling whispered, his voice cracking as he leaned back into his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. "It doesn't matter where we got it," Elena said, her voice clear, sharp, and cutting through the quiet of the room. She looked down at the banker with a cold, unforgiving stare. "What matters, Richard, is that this folder contains the wire transfers that prove you personally directed the embezzlement of $4 million from the city's pension fund to Marcus Thorne's super PAC. If this reaches the federal authorities, your bank will be liquidated, and you will spend the rest of your life in a maximum security prison." Sterling's breathing became ragged. He looked from Elena to Victor, his expression shifting from arrogant defiance to desperate terror. "Thorne told me it was safe. He told me the federal regulators were in his pocket. He promised that nothing would ever come back to my institution." Victor leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl that commanded the entire room. "Killing a man only costs a bullet, Richard," Victor said, his dark eyes reflecting the cold, gray sky outside. "But destroying a man's legacy, his bank, and his name is how you permanently kill the desire for betrayal. We do not use knives, and we do not use guns in this boardroom. We use leverage." The banker wiped a line of sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. He looked at the floor, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his own decisions pressed down upon him. "What do you want from me, Vance? You know that if I turn against the senator, his people will make sure I don't see the end of the year." Victor stood up, his presence filling the vast room, dominating the older man's sense of self-worth. "We don't want you to fight him on the streets," Victor said, his tone turning crisp and authoritative. "We want you to call a press conference at 3 o'clock this afternoon. You will announce that the Sterling Financial Group is severing all ties with the Thorne gubernatorial campaign due to irregularities in the campaign's financial disclosures. You will present the documents that Elena has provided you, and you will state that you were misled by the senator's staff." Sterling stared at the papers, his mind racing as he weighed his options. The choice was between a certain, slow ruin with Thorne and a chance at survival with the Vance family's protection. "And if I do this?" Sterling asked, his voice shaking. "If you do this," Victor replied, a cold, sharp smile touching his lips, "you will keep your bank, your son will remain free from federal scrutiny, and the Vance Syndicate will provide a security detail to ensure that the senator's people do not come near your building. You have 4 hours to prepare the statement, Richard. Do not make the wrong choice. Victor turned and walked toward the glass doors, not looking back to see if the banker would comply. Elena followed close behind, her head held high, her black heels clicking against the marble floor. The purge had begun, and the first pillar of the senator's empire was already crumbling from within. The fallout from Richard Sterling's afternoon press conference hit the Chicago political landscape like a seismic shockwave. By 6 o'clock, every major news network was running the footage of the pale, sweating bank chairman announcing his immediate severing of ties with the Marcus Thorne gubernatorial campaign, citing irreconcilable financial discrepancies. By 8 o'clock, the state's attorney general had announced a preliminary inquiry into the super PAC's ledgers. The first pillar of Thorne's empire had not just crumbled, it had been pulverized into dust. Inside the Vance estate, the atmosphere was one of calculated, quiet triumph. The heavy velvet curtains in the study were drawn against the dark, rainy night. Victor Vance stood by the fireplace, nursing a glass of 20-year-old scotch, watching the flames crackle and spit against the iron grate. He wore a simple black turtleneck and dark trousers, the armor of his bespoke suits discarded for the evening. Elena sat curled in the corner of the leather sofa, a thick woolen blanket draped over her shoulders. The exhaustion of the past 4 days was finally catching up to her, but her dark eyes were alight with a fierce, burning satisfaction. She watched the silent television screen mounted on the far wall, where news anchors debated the sudden implosion of Senator Thorne's flawless public image. "He is bleeding," Elena murmured, her voice barely rising above the crackle of the fire. "Marcus has spent his entire life building a fortress of untouchable people around him. Sterling was the keystone. Without him, the other donors will panic. They will start demanding their money back to distance themselves from a federal probe." Victor turned from the fire, the amber liquid in his glass catching the light. Panic is the greatest catalyst for betrayal. Thorne will not sit quietly while his life's work is dismantled. He is a predator backed into a corner, and that is precisely when he is most dangerous. He will stop playing by the rules of politics and start playing by the rules of the street. Before Elena could respond, the heavy oak doors of the study burst open, shattering the quiet intimacy of the room. Frank Moretti practically sprinted over the threshold, his face devoid of color, his chest heaving as if he had just run a mile. He held a secure satellite phone in his trembling hand. "Victor," Frank gasped, his voice tight with raw panic. "We have a critical breach." The relaxed posture of the syndicate boss vanished in a microsecond. Victor placed his glass on the mantel with a sharp, definitive click. The room seemed to drop 10 degrees in temperature. "Report." "It's the Wisconsin safe house," Frank said, swallowing hard. "The perimeter alarms just tripped. A Black Ops tactical team, unmarked vans, heavily armed, military precision, just cut the main power lines. They are attempting to breach the outer walls right now. They bypassed the first 3 layers of early warning sensors. Somebody gave them the exact blueprints of the security grid." Elena felt the blood drain entirely from her face. The heavy woolen blanket slipped from her shoulders, pooling on the floor as she shot to her feet. The breath was knocked from her lungs. Leo. Her younger brother, the only family she had left in the world, the boy she had sacrificed everything to protect, was in that house. "No," Elena whispered, her hands flying to her mouth, her eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. "No, no, no. Marcus found him. He's going to kill him, Victor. He's going to execute him just to send me a message." "Quiet," Victor commanded. It was not a shout, but the sheer, crushing authority in his tone instantly silenced the room. He did not look at Elena. His eyes were fixed entirely on Frank, his mind operating at a terrifying, tactical speed. "How many men do we have inside?" Victor demanded, moving swiftly toward the large oak desk to open a hidden compartment containing a communications array. "4 of our best operators," Frank replied, his hands shaking as he pulled up the tactical feed on the estate's main monitor. "But they are outgunned. The assault team has at least 12 men. They are moving methodically. They aren't local police. These are private military contractors paid for by Thorne's shadow funds." Victor picked up the heavy radio receiver, his face carved from stone. Patch me through to the extraction team leader on standby in Milwaukee. Tell them they have exactly 4 minutes to put boots on the ground at the safe house before the breach is complete. Authorization code, Black Winter. Lethal force is entirely sanctioned. The next 20 minutes were a localized, agonizing version of hell. Elena paced the length of the study, her fingernails biting so deeply into her palms that they drew crescent-shaped drops of blood. The radio crackled with bursts of static, followed by the terrifying, chaotic sounds of heavy gunfire, shouting, and the screeching of tires. Victor stood perfectly still at the center of the room, an immovable anchor in the storm, issuing crisp, emotionless orders to the extraction team. Hold the stairwell. Do not let them breach the second floor. Gas the ventilation if they stack on the front door, Victor instructed, his voice as cold as ice. Elena dropped to her knees by the sofa, pressing her hands against her ears, unable to process the violence happening hundreds of miles away. She closed her eyes, praying to whatever deity was listening to spare her brother. If Leo died because she had chosen to fight back, she would never survive the guilt. The scars on her skin would be nothing compared to the destruction of her soul. Target secured. A rough, breathless voice suddenly crackled over the radio, breaking through the static. I repeat, the package is secure. We have Leo in the armored transport. We took heavy hits, but we held the line. The hostile team is retreating into the woods. We are en route to the Chicago estate. ETA is 2 hours. A ragged sob tore from Elena's throat. She collapsed forward, pressing her forehead against the Persian rug, her body shaking violently as the adrenaline left her system in a sudden crashing wave. Victor slowly placed the radio receiver down. He exhaled a long, measured breath, the tension leaving his broad shoulders. He walked over to Elena, knelt beside her, and gently placed his large, scarred hand on the back of her head, anchoring her back to reality. He is safe, Elena. It is over. He is coming here. But as Elena wept in relief, Victor's eyes met Frank's across the room. The relief was instantly replaced by a dark, murderous fury. Nobody outside of this room, myself and Julian, knew the exact coordinates and grid bypass codes of that safe house, Victor said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper. Frank's face turned grim. Julian was one of Victor's most trusted lieutenants, a man who had grown up in the syndicate, a man who had broken bread at Victor's own table. I will have Julian brought to the basement immediately, Frank said quietly. 2 hours later, the atmosphere in the soundproofed basement of the Vance estate was heavy with the smell of damp concrete, copper, and profound betrayal. The room was sparsely furnished. A single metal chair bolted to the floor, a surgical steel table, and a solitary overhead bulb hanging from a wire, casting harsh, unforgiving shadows. Julian, a man in his late 30s with a sharp jawline and expensive taste in suits, was strapped to the chair. His face was bruised, his lips split from where the syndicate guards had apprehended him, attempting to flee the city with a duffel bag containing $500,000 in unmarked, non-sequential bills. Victor walked down the concrete steps slowly, the rhythmic click of his dress shoes echoing in the cavernous space. He carried no weapons. He didn't need to. The sheer, overwhelming gravity of his presence was enough to make the air in the room feel unbreathable. Frank stood silently in the corner, his arms crossed, his face a mask of sorrow and disgust. Julian looked up, his eyes wide, darting frantically around the room. Boss, Victor, listen to me. You have to listen to me. Thorne's people, they threatened my wife. They said they would burn my house to the ground if I didn't give them the grid codes. I didn't want to do it. I swear to God I didn't want to do it, but it was $500,000 in my family's safety. I was terrified. Victor stopped 3 feet from the chair. He looked down at the man he had mentored, the man he had trusted with the lives of his people. There was no rage in Victor's eyes. There was only an infinite, freezing void. Did they touch your wife, Julian? Victor asked softly. Julian swallowed, sweat pouring down his face. No. No, they just showed me pictures of her at the grocery store. It was a warning. And did you come to me with this warning? Victor asked, his voice remaining terrifyingly calm. Did you come to your family, to the men who have protected you for 15 years, and ask for our shield? Did you ask me to put guards on your house? Did you ask me to hunt the men who threatened your wife?" Julian opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The truth was a heavy stone in the room. He hadn't asked for protection. He had taken the bribe. He had looked at the duffel bag of cash and decided that his loyalty had a price tag. Victor reached into his pocket and pulled out a silver lighter. He snapped it open, watching the small flame flicker in the dim light, his face an impenetrable mask of sorrow and cold authority. "We are not politicians, Julian. We do not operate on polls or promises or contracts signed in ink," Victor said, the flame illuminating the hard lines of his face. He stepped closer, ensuring the traitor heard every single syllable. "Absolute loyalty isn't about never being tempted. Every man has a price, and every man feels fear. But true loyalty is what happens when you face that temptation, when you look into the abyss, and you still remember exactly who pulled you out of the mud when you were nothing. You betrayed me, and as a man, I have the capacity to forgive a moment of weakness. But you sold out an innocent boy. You betrayed the fundamental principle of this family to protect the helpless. And for that, there is no forgiveness. You have to pay the price." Victor snapped the lighter shut, plunging the room back into harsh shadows. He turned his back on the chair and began walking up the concrete stairs. "Frank," Victor said without looking back, "handle it, neatly." As the heavy steel door of the basement closed behind him, cutting off Julian's sudden, desperate screams, Victor Vance adjusted his cuffs. The traitor was gone, the message was sent, and the war with Marcus Thorne had officially crossed the point of no return. The reunion in the grand foyer of the Vance estate the following morning was a quiet, intensely private affair. The heavy oak doors opened to reveal Leo, a 19-year-old boy with dark, unruly hair and eyes that mirrored his sister's depth. He was pale, exhausted, and sporting a bandage over his left eyebrow from the chaotic extraction, but he was alive. Elena had been waiting at the bottom of the grand staircase since dawn. The moment she saw him, the stoic, fierce armor she had worn for the past few days completely shattered. She ran across the marble floor, her bare feet making no sound, and threw her arms around her brother's neck, burying her face into his shoulder. She wept, not the silent, elegant tears of a politician's wife, but the loud, breathless, agonizing sobs of a mother who had just pulled her child from a burning building. Leo held her tightly, burying his face in her hair. "I'm okay, Elle," he kept whispering, his own voice cracking. "I'm okay, the guys got me out, I'm safe." Standing on the landing of the second floor, partially hidden by the shadows of a marble pillar, Victor watched the scene unfold. He was a man who traded in power, violence, and cold calculation. Emotional displays were typically viewed as liabilities in his world. Yet, as he watched Elena clutch her brother as if he were the only solid thing in a collapsing universe, Victor felt an unfamiliar, heavy tightening in his chest. For the first time in his meticulously controlled life, Victor realized that his motivation for destroying Senator Marcus Thorne had fundamentally shifted. It was no longer about protecting his shipping lanes or maintaining his absolute authority over the Chicago underworld. It was about her. It was about ensuring that the haunted, terrified look never returned to Elena's eyes. It was a dangerous realization, a vulnerability that a kingpin could ill afford. He turned away and walked silently back to his study, closing the heavy doors behind him. Hours later, the sun had fully risen, casting a bright, cold light across Lake Michigan. Elena walked into Victor's study. She had showered, changed into a crisp white blouse and dark slacks, and her dark hair fell in soft, natural waves over her shoulders. The bruised, battered bride who had collapsed at the cathedral was gone. In her place stood a woman of striking resilience, carrying herself with a quiet, undeniable dignity. Victor was sitting behind his mahogany desk. Spread out before him were 3 items: a thick manila dossier, 2 dark blue, meticulously forged European passports, and a set of first-class flight itineraries departing for Geneva that evening. He looked up as Elena approached the desk. He did not smile, but the hard, impenetrable mask he wore for his men softened slightly. He is resting? He's asleep, Elena replied softly, sitting in the leather chair across from him. Your doctor gave him a mild sedative. He's going to be fine. Thank you, Victor. There are no words. I owe you my life, and I owe you his. Victor waved his hand dismissively, his face serious. He pushed the items on the desk forward until they rested directly in front of her. You owe me nothing, Elena. Our arrangement was that you provide the intelligence to cripple Thorne's financial infrastructure, and I provide security. You have upheld your end of the bargain. Thorne's campaign is in free fall. His donors are fleeing, and the federal prosecutors are currently drafting subpoenas based on the files you provided. He tapped a scarred finger against the dark blue cover of the passports. But the endgame is approaching, and it will be brutal. Thorne has realized that he cannot beat us in the boardroom, which means he will attempt to use the full, unchecked force of the state police and his private contractors to eradicate us. The streets of Chicago are about to become a war zone. Elena looked down at the passports. She saw her photograph inside one, next to a fabricated name. She saw Leo's face in the other. What is this, Victor? She asked, her voice barely a whisper, though she already knew the answer. This is your exit, Victor said, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the quiet room. I have established untraceable accounts for you in Switzerland, funded with enough capital to ensure that you and Leo will live comfortably for the rest of your lives. The jet is fueled and waiting at a private airstrip. If you leave tonight, you will vanish like ghosts. Marcus will never find you. You will be safe. Elena stared at the flight itinerary. Geneva, the Swiss Alps. A quiet, anonymous life an ocean away from the violence, the politics, and the monster who had kept her in a gilded cage. It was everything she had dreamed of during the long, terrifying nights locked in Thorne's mansion. It was the ultimate escape. She could take Leo, run, and never look over her shoulder again. Victor leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes never leaving her face, watching the internal struggle play out behind her eyes. If you choose to stay, Victor continued, his tone turning grave and unyielding, there is no guarantee of safety. You will not be hiding in the shadows. You will have to stand in the light. You will have to walk into a federal courtroom, sit on a witness stand, and testify against a man who will use every dirty trick in the political playbook to destroy your reputation. He will call you a liar, a thief, and a madwoman. You will be the primary target of his wrath until the moment a judge locks him away. The study fell into absolute silence. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the antique grandfather clock in the corner. Elena slowly reached out and picked up the passport. She felt the smooth texture of the cover, the weight of a guaranteed, peaceful future resting in the palm of her hand. She thought of the bruises fading on her neck. She thought of the burn scar on her wrist, a permanent physical reminder of the cost of obedience. She thought of the years she had spent allowing Marcus to dictate her worth, reducing her to a terrified, compliant doll hidden beneath layers of expensive makeup. Then, she looked across the desk at Victor. She saw the man who had caught her when she fell, the man who had refused to hand her back to her abuser, the man who had waged war against the most powerful politician in the state simply because he believed that human respect was a line that should never be crossed. Elena placed the passport back on the desk. With slow, deliberate movements, she picked up the flight itinerary to Geneva. She gripped the edges of the thick paper and, with a sharp, echoing tear, ripped the itinerary precisely in half. She placed the torn pieces next to the passports. Victor's eyes widened slightly, a microscopic break in his stoic facade. Elena sat up perfectly straight, her shoulders pulled back, her chin held high. The lingering shadows of the victim had entirely vanished from her eyes, replaced by the fierce, unyielding fire of a queen reclaiming her throne. I have spent half my life playing the quiet, compliant victim beneath heavy layers of makeup, Elena said, her voice ringing clear, strong, and absolute in the quiet study. I allowed a coward to dictate my worth because I believed that survival meant being invisible. But starting today, I refuse to run. I would rather be a scarred warrior standing in the light than a perfect, unbroken doll hiding in a glass cage across the world. She leaned forward, placing both of her hands firmly on the mahogany desk, meeting the gaze of the most dangerous man in Chicago without a single ounce of fear. I am staying, Victor. I am going to stand in that courtroom. I am going to point my finger at that monster, and I am going to tear his legacy down brick by brick. I want to be the one to end his empire. Victor stared at her in silence for a long, heavy moment. The air between them crackled with an intense, unspoken electricity. He looked at the torn pieces of the flight ticket, and then back up to the beautiful, scarred, fiercely empowered woman sitting before him. A slow, genuine smile, the first true smile she had ever seen him wear, spread across Victor's face. It was a smile of profound respect, a silent acknowledgement that he was no longer looking at a refugee seeking shelter. He was looking at an equal. Victor slowly stood up and buttoned his suit jacket, his dark eyes burning with renewed lethal purpose. "Then we have work to do, Ms. Hayes," Victor said smoothly. "Let us go prepare for war." The grandfather clock in the grand hallway of the Vance estate ticked with the steady, unyielding rhythm of a judge's gavel. Outside, the autumn storm had broken, leaving behind a heavy gray mist that rolled off the dark waters of Lake Michigan and pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Victor Vance's private study. The room was heavy with the scent of ozone, aged bourbon, and the dry, ancient dust of leather-bound books. It was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The deadline Richard Sterling had been given to expose the embezzlement scheme had passed 3 hours ago. By noon, the Sterling Financial Group had released a formal, devastating statement to the Associated Press, accompanied by a comprehensive 50-page dossier detailing the illegal diversion of municipal bond revenues into Marcus Thorne's gubernatorial campaign. By 2 o'clock, the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago was swarming with FBI agents, and a judge had signed an emergency warrant for the senator's arrest on charges of wire fraud, campaign finance violations, and racketeering. Victor stood by the marble fireplace, his hands resting on the cool stone mantel. He wore a bespoke charcoal three-piece suit, his posture relaxed but coiled with the lethal, watchful stillness of a panther waiting in the tall grass. Beside him, standing near the mahogany desk, was Elena. She wore a simple, high-necked cream silk blouse and dark, tailored trousers. Her dark hair was loose, falling over her shoulders in natural, unpretentious waves. Her face was completely bare of cosmetics. The faint yellowish bruises along her jawline had begun to fade, but the small, pale scar near her temple remained, stark and visible. She wore no jewelry save for a plain, silver watch on her left wrist. She was not the pale, trembling woman who had collapsed at the cathedral. She was a woman who had walked through the fire and emerged, tempered by the heat. "The building is surrounded," Frank Moretti said, stepping into the study with a heavy, secure tablet in his hand. His voice was tight, vibrating with suppressed nervous energy. "Thorne's security detail abandoned the state capitol 2 hours ago when the warrant was issued. But Thorne isn't at his home. Our scouts spotted his black Lincoln Navigator moving south on Lakeshore Drive 5 minutes ago. He is coming here, Victor, alone." Victor did not turn from the fire. He let out a long, measured breath, the amber liquid in his glass swirling in rhythm with the ticking of the clock. He is desperate. A cornered predator does not run when he realizes the trap has sprung. He tries to tear the throat out of the hunter. "Let him in." "Victor," Elena said, her voice barely a whisper, though it was steady and clear. "If he comes here, he will be armed. He has nothing left to lose." Victor turned to look at her, his dark, impenetrable eyes softening as they rested upon her bare face. He took a step toward her, his heavy leather shoes clicking against the hardwood floor. "He can bring an army, Elena, and it will not change the outcome of this day. You are safe in this house. You have my word." Before Frank could respond or argue the tactical risk of allowing an armed politician into the estate, the heavy iron-wrought gates at the end of the long private driveway buzzed with the signal of arrival. A few moments later, The crunch of heavy tires against wet gravel echoed through the quiet house. The double doors of the study remained open, guarded by four heavily armed capos standing with their hands folded over their suit jackets. The atmosphere in the room turned as cold and heavy as a crypt. The heavy footsteps that followed were fast, erratic, and lacked the steady, measured cadence of a man in control. Marcus Thorne burst into the study, his appearance a sharp, shocking contrast to the pristine, powerful image he projected on television. His custom Italian suit was wrinkled, damp from the rain, and the slicked-back hair that had been his trademark was falling in disarray over his forehead. His eyes were wide, bloodshot, and darted frantically around the room, settling first on Victor, and then, with a look of pure, venomous hatred, upon Elena. "You ungrateful, treacherous bitch," Marcus hissed, his voice rising to a high, vibrating pitch that bordered on a scream. He took a step forward, his hand reaching instinctively toward the bulge beneath his left armpit. "You think you can hide behind this criminal? You think this piece of trash mobster can save you from what I will do to you when I get you out of here?" Before Thorne's fingers could clear the fabric of his jacket, the four capos in the room stepped forward, drawing their sidearms with a synchronized, terrifying metallic click. The weapons were trained directly on the senator's chest. Thorne froze, his hand hovering over his holster, his chest heaving as he stared down the barrels of four customized, silenced pistols. Victor did not draw a weapon. He didn't need to. He took one slow, deliberate step away from the fireplace, placing himself between Elena and the politician. He towered over Thorne, his presence filling the room and reducing the frantic, desperate man to a small, insignificant figure in a damp suit. "Lower your voices, gentlemen," Victor commanded softly. The capos obeyed instantly, though their weapons remained trained on the target. Victor looked at Thorne with a cold, glassy stare that held no trace of anger, only the profound, silent judgment of an executioner. "You are trespassing on private property, Senator," Victor said, his voice a low, resonant register that vibrated through the limestone walls. "And you are speaking to the woman who managed the funds that kept your corrupt career alive for 10 years. Show some respect for the house you are standing in, or your time on this earth will end before the rain stops." Thorne let out a harsh, ugly laugh, though his hands trembled as he slowly brought them away from his holster and held them in the air. He glared at Victor, his face twisting into a mask of furious desperation. "Respect? You talk to me about respect, you piece of scum?" Thorne spat, his eyes bulging as he looked around the room, as if trying to find a camera or an audience. "I am a United States Senator. I am the man who writes the laws that keep your illegal ports from being seized by the federal government. You are nothing but a common street thug who learned how to dress in expensive wool. And you," he added, turning his venomous gaze back to Elena, "you are just an empty vessel, a broken, pathetic little girl from a bankrupt family that I took in out of the kindness of my heart. You think these men respect you? They use women like tissues and throw them in the gutter when they're done." Elena stepped out from behind Victor's shoulder. She didn't flinch. She didn't clutch her arms or retreat to the safety of the leather sofa. She stood straight, her chin held high, her eyes locking onto the man who had terrorized her for years. "You didn't take me in, Marcus," Elena said, her voice clear, sharp, and ringing with absolute confidence. "You trapped me. You used the debt my father left behind to buy my compliance, and you used the threat of my brother's life to keep me quiet while you stole from the very people who trusted you to represent them. You are not a leader. You are a thief hiding behind a flag." Thorne's face turned an ugly, mottled shade of red. He took a step toward her, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, his eyes wide with a rage that had lost all connection to reality. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" Thorne yelled, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You think that by bringing these documents to the feds you've won? I have judges in my pocket who will throw this case out before it reaches a grand jury. I have foreign accounts that you couldn't even dream of accessing. And Vance will be dead within a month when the syndicate families find out he let personal feelings destroy their shipping lanes. You're going to jail, Elena. You hear me? You're going to spend the rest of your life in a cold cell, and I will make sure the guards know exactly how to treat a rat." Victor did not wait for Elena to respond. He reached out and placed a firm, steadying hand on her shoulder. The touch was warm, electric, and grounding. He looked at Thorne with an expression of cold, clinical disgust. "You are a fool, Marcus," Victor said softly, the tone turning as sharp and cold as a winter wind. "You look at these documents and you see a political dispute. You look at Elena and you see a piece of property that broke its chain, but you don't understand the game you are playing because you don't understand the first thing about human worth." Victor took a slow, heavy step forward, forcing Thorne to retreat a step until his back hit the edge of the mahogany desk. "The value of a person is not measured by a flawless face or the numbers in a bank account, Marcus," Victor said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a deep, resonant growl that commanded the entire room. "It is measured by the kindness and the fierce, unbreakable spirit they manage to keep after experiencing absolute agony. And you, Marcus, underneath that expensive suit, behind all the titles and the corrupt campaign funds, you are the most worthless man I have ever met." Thorne's breathing stopped for a fraction of a second. The manic fire in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden, terrifying realization that the world he had built was completely gone. He reached into his pocket, his fingers frantically searching for a phone or a hidden device, but his hands shook so violently that he dropped his keys onto the Persian rug. "No," Thorne whispered, his voice cracking and losing all its high, angry pitch. He looked from Victor to Elena, his face pale, his forehead beaded with cold sweat. "You can't do this to me. I have the governor's personal number. I have the support of the party's central committee. You're a criminal, Vance. You have no right to judge me." Victor turned to Frank, who stood in the corner with his tablet glowing in the dim light. "Frank, call the precinct downtown. Tell them the senator is here and that we are ready to hand him over to the federal marshals. Ensure that the press is waiting at the front gate. We want the world to see the great Marcus Thorne leave this house in handcuffs." "Right away, Victor," Frank said, pulling a phone from his pocket and speaking in a low, rapid tone. Thorne spun around, his hand flying to his holster once more, his mind fracturing under the pressure of the impending arrest. "You won't take me! You won't take me alive, Vance! I'll—" Before the senator could draw his weapon, Victor moved with the speed and precision of a professional fighter. He brought his heavy walking cane down with a sharp, echoing crack against Thorne's right wrist. The weapon clattered onto the hardwood floor, sliding several feet away before coming to a stop near Elena's feet. Thorne let out a sharp, breathless cry of pain, clutching his bruised wrist with his left hand as he sank to his knees on the rug. The fire, the arrogance, and the political power had completely evaporated, leaving only a broken, pathetic man groveling on the floor of the study. Victor stood over him, his dark eyes devoid of any emotion, staring down as if observing an insect on the pavement. "We are not politicians, Marcus," Victor said, his voice as smooth and cold as glass. "If we let vengeance swallow our reason, we eventually become the very monsters we just put down. I will not kill you, because you are not worth the lead it would take. The federal marshals will take you, the courts will strip you of your title, and you will spend the rest of your days in a cage, watching the empire you built from the suffering of others rot into dust." 2 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the study opened again. Two armed federal marshals, accompanied by Frank Moretti, walked into the room. They did not look at Victor. They knew the parameters of the agreement that had been made with the district attorney's office. They approached the groveling politician, pulled his arms behind his back, and secured his wrists in cold steel handcuffs. Thorne did not look up as he was pulled to his feet. He stared at the carpet, his face pale, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. As he was led past Elena, he turned his head slightly, his bloodshot eyes fixing upon her bare face one last time. "You will pay for this, Elena," Thorne whispered, a pathetic, trembling threat that held no weight. "They won't protect you forever." Elena took a half step forward, her bare face calm, radiant, and unforgiving. "I don't need protection anymore, Marcus," Elena said, her voice clear and resonant. "I survived you. That means I can survive anything." The federal marshals led the senator out of the study, their heavy footsteps echoing down the long, limestone corridor until the front doors of the estate slammed shut. The study fell into a profound, heavy silence. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a soft gray twilight that filtered through the large windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the quiet air. Victor turned from the door. He walked slowly back to the fireplace, his heavy walking cane clicking against the floorboards. He picked up his crystal tumbler, poured a fresh measure of amber liquid, and looked at Elena. She stood in the center of the room, her silhouette framed by the fading light of the afternoon. She did not look like the victim of a counterfeit wedding anymore. She looked like a woman who had reclaimed her own destiny, standing tall and unbroken in the heart of the wolf's den. "It is done," Victor said softly, the tone warm, resonant, and filled with a profound sense of peace. Elena walked across the Persian rug, the distance between them closing until she was standing just a foot away from the syndicate boss. She looked up into his dark, impenetrable eyes, her bare face calm and radiant. "It is just beginning, Victor," Elena replied, a faint, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth. She reached out and placed her right hand over his scarred knuckles, the touch warm, intimate, and strong. "We have an empire to rebuild." The morning sun broke over the Chicago skyline, washing the gray concrete and steel of the city in a sharp golden light. The storm of the previous night had completely cleared, leaving the air crisp and cold, smelling of wet earth and the deep, endless blue of Lake Michigan. In the grand study of the Vance estate, the mood was one of quiet, profound relief. The digitization of Marcus Thorne's shadow ledgers had triggered a cascade of federal raids across the state. By dawn, 3 separate federal agencies had moved on the senator's properties, seizing offshore servers, frozen assets, and stacks of documents that implicated dozens of corrupt officials in the city council and the state's central bank. Victor Vance sat behind his heavy mahogany desk, a steaming cup of dark black coffee resting beside a stack of legal briefs. He wore a simple dark cashmere sweater, his hands resting on the polished surface as he reviewed the preliminary statements of the new financial restructuring. The syndicate's shipping lanes were no longer under threat of regulatory seizure. The politicians who had taken bribes from Thorne were now falling over themselves to distance their names from his administration. Elena Hayes sat near the window, looking out over the wooded bluffs that sloped down toward the lake. She was dressed in a soft, cream-colored wool sweater and gray trousers. Her face was bare, clean, and radiant in the morning light. The yellowish bruises on her jawline had faded, leaving only a clear, unblemished complexion. For the first time in 10 years, she was not checking her phone for threatening messages, nor was she listening for the sound of a heavy car in the driveway. Her brother Leo was asleep in the east wing of the estate, his extraction from the safe house having left him tired but physically unharmed. The doctor had given him a clean bill of health, and he was already talking about finishing his degree in business administration at Northwestern University, far from the reach of the senator's influence. "The Board of Trustees at the University of Chicago just called," Frank Moretti said, stepping into the study with a freshly poured cup of coffee in his hand. He looked tired, but the tension that had lined his face for the past week had finally dissipated. "They are offering you an honorary seat on the Committee for Urban Development, Victor. They want to distance themselves from the Thorne administration by aligning with legitimate investment groups." Victor did not look up from the briefs. A faint, sharp, and cynical smile touched the corners of his mouth. "They only want our money, Frank. But let them have their seat. It gives us a voice in the city's infrastructure that no politician can strip away. What about Thorne's properties on the North Shore?" "The federal receivers have taken control of the real estate," Frank replied, taking a sip from his cup. "They will be auctioned off next month to pay back the city's pension fund. Elena's name is entirely cleared from the embezzlement charges. The district attorney's office issued a formal apology this morning, stating that she was a victim of coercion and had no knowledge of the shadow accounts." Elena turned her head from the window, her dark eyes flashing with a quiet, fierce satisfaction. "He thought he could erase my identity, Frank. He thought that by taking my father's legacy and turning it into a debt, he could make me into a ghost who signed whatever papers he put in front of her. But he was the one who was erased. The public knows him for what he is now, a coward who hid behind a title. He will spend the next 20 years in a maximum security facility in Colorado, Frank said, his voice grim but satisfied. The judge made an example of him. No bail, no political favors, and no special treatment. It's over. Frank nodded respectfully to both of them and stepped out of the study, pulling the heavy oak doors shut and leaving the room in a quiet, weighted silence. Victor pushed the legal papers aside and stood up. He walked slowly across the Persian rug, his soft leather shoes making no sound, and stopped just a few feet from where Elena sat by the glass. The scent of coffee and old paper hung in the air, creating a private, enclosed atmosphere that felt completely isolated from the rest of the world. "You haven't slept much, Elena," Victor said softly, his voice low, firm, and resonant. "You don't have to keep watching the gate. The house is secure. The guards on the perimeter are doubled, and Thorne's associates have fled the state." Elena looked up into his dark, impenetrable eyes. She did not look away. She reached out, her fingers resting lightly on the wool of his sweater, feeling the solid, unyielding warmth of his presence. "I'm not watching the gate because I'm afraid, Victor," Elena said, her voice clear and untroubled. "I'm watching the morning because I've never seen it so clearly. For years, my life was a series of closed doors, locked basements, and perfect smiles that I had to paint on my face before facing the cameras. I didn't realize how much of myself I had lost until I collapsed at that altar. You didn't just save my brother, Victor. You gave me back my voice." Victor looked down at her, the hard, calculated expression that defined his life as a syndicate boss melting away, replaced by an intense, unspoken appreciation. He reached up and gently touched the small, pale scar near her temple, his thumb tracing the soft skin with a reverence that surprised even himself. "You had the courage to collapse, Elena," Victor said, his voice dropping an octave until it was a deep, gravelly whisper. "You could have stood there. You could have endured the pain, taken the ring, and lived the lie for another 10 years. But you chose to collapse. You chose to collapse because your humanity was stronger than your fear. That is the true measure of strength. That is why he could never break you." Elena leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a fraction of a second. She felt the heavy, dark shadow of the past 10 years lift from her shoulders, dissolving like mist in the morning light. "What happens to the Vance family now?" Elena asked, looking up into his eyes once more. "The police know we were the ones who provided the evidence to the federal marshals. The other syndicates in the city will know that the game has changed." Victor turned and walked back to the desk, his presence filling the vast room. He picked up a thick, black, leather-bound ledger that contained the syndicate's clean investments in real estate and shipping. "The game has changed," Victor agreed, a dark, dangerous glint in his eyes. "We are no longer going to operate in the shadows, running contraband and settling disputes in the streets. We are going to use the leverage we have acquired to legitimize the city's transport network. We are going to build hospitals, fund public libraries on the South Side, and provide housing for the families that Thorne's administration left in the cold. We will be businessmen, Elena, but we will be businessmen who do not forget the principles of the family." He reached across the desk and tapped a pen against the ledger. "I need someone I can trust to manage the new Urban Development Trust. Someone who knows the financial flows of the city, who understands the difference between an honest investment and a corrupt politician's slush fund. I need someone who isn't afraid to stand in the light." Elena smiled. The faint hollows of her cheeks, once a sign of her exhaustion and fear, were now the markers of a beautiful, striking, and deeply resilient woman. She stood up from the window, smoothed the cream silk of her blouse, and walked straight to the center of the mahogany desk. "You need an accountant who isn't afraid of the wolves," Elena said, her voice steady and ringing with absolute confidence. "I need an equal," Victor replied, a rare, warm, and genuine smile touching his lips. Elena placed her right hand on the black leather ledger, right over the embossed initials of the Vance family. "Then consider it done, Mr. Vance. We have an empire to rebuild from the ashes, and this time, we will build it with the doors wide open." The study fell into a quiet, warm, and electric silence. The long, difficult journey from the counterfeit wedding in the cathedral to the heart of the wolf's den had been completed. The scars on her skin were no longer marks of a victim's terror. They were the credentials of a warrior who had learned to use her enemy's shadow to flip the board. The soft, late autumn sun had dipped below the Chicago skyline, painting the waters of Lake Michigan in deep, shifting shades of purple and gold. The Vance estate was peaceful. The heavy iron-wrought gates at the entrance were closed, but the guards on the perimeter were no longer tense. The air carried the crisp, clean scent of the turning season, unburdened by the threat of violence. In the east wing of the estate, the sound of classical piano music drifted from the open windows of the sunroom. Leo was sitting at the grand piano, practicing a difficult, intricate piece by Chopin. His face was relaxed, the bruise near his eyebrow having faded, and his posture was upright and healthy. He was studying his university textbooks between movements, his life returned to him by the fierce courage of his sister. In the garden near the conservatory, Victor and Elena were walking slowly along the gravel pathway. The rose bushes, their leaves turning deep crimson and brown, lined the path, releasing a faint, sweet, and ancient fragrance that lingered in the still air. Elena wore a tailored charcoal trench coat over a dark blue dress, her dark hair pinned back by an elegant, simple silver comb. Her face was bare, clean, and completely devoid of cosmetic foundation. The small scar near her temple was visible in the fading light, but it no longer carried the weight of a painful memory. It was simply a part of her, a testament to the fact that she had survived the absolute worst the city had to offer. Victor walked beside her, his tall, imposing figure balanced by the steady tap of his walking cane against the gravel. He wore a simple black cashmere topcoat, his hands buried in his pockets, his dark, impenetrable eyes watching the rolling waves of the lake in the distance. "He is doing well with the Chopin," Elena said, her voice low, steady, and warm as she listened to the music drifting from the house. "He hasn't played like that since our father's company was seized. The pressure, the threats, it silenced him for years." Victor stopped on the gravel pathway and turned to face her. The fading golden light of the afternoon illuminated the hard, handsome lines of his scarred face. "He is young, Elena. He will recover, just as you have recovered. The scars we carry do not define our lives. They simply show where we have been and the distance we have traveled." Elena reached up, her fingers lightly touching the lapel of his topcoat. She looked into his dark eyes, her expression one of profound, unmistakable affection. For years, she had been a piece of property, a prop to be hidden or displayed at the whim of a tyrant. Here, beside the most feared man in the Midwest, she had found a sanctuary built on respect, honesty, and a mutual understanding of what it meant to be broken and rebuilt. "People are so easily blinded by the glamorous illusions on the outside," Elena said softly, her voice carrying the rhythm of the evening breeze. "I spent 10 years trying to be the perfect woman under a mask of foundation, all to avoid the violence of a man who didn't know the first thing about love. I thought that perfection was a shield. But after surviving the storm, I realized that the one thing that keeps us standing in this brutal world isn't ultimate power or mountains of cash." Victor took her hand, his strong, scarred fingers lacing through hers, holding her close to his side. He leaned in, his dark eyes reflecting the deep gold of the sunset. "It is finding that one person," Victor said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the quiet garden, "who is brave enough to look at your deepest scars, your ugliest shadows, and smile as they say, 'It's okay, we'll rebuild from here.'" He paused, a rare, soft, and triumphant smile touching his lips. "That is true absolute power." The music from the sunroom swelled, the notes rising into the autumn air like a flock of birds taking flight over the dark, restless waters of the lake. Elena smiled, her bare face radiant, beautiful, and completely unhidden. She leaned her head on Victor's shoulder, her hand firm and warm within his. The counterfeit wedding in the cathedral was nothing but a distant, forgotten memory. The empire of the corrupt politician had been dismantled brick by brick, and the hidden truth beneath the bride's makeup had been brought to light. The game of kings had ended, and a new world was being built from the ashes, with the doors wide open to the sky.
Ladies and gentlemen, after spending 3 decades chronicling the lives of underworld kingpins and the dark corridors of power, I can tell you a fundamental truth. The most compelling mafia stories are never really about the bullets. They are about the brutal, unvarnished realities of the human soul. The story of Victor Vance and Elena Hayes is not merely a tale of crime, it is a masterclass in resilience, the anatomy of true power, and the courage it takes to shatter our own illusions. Let us first look at the bride, Elena. Society constantly demands perfection, teaching us to paint over our traumas with heavy layers of cosmetic foundation. We are told to hide our bruises to maintain peace. But Elena's collapse at the altar teaches us that perfection is not a shield. It is a cage designed by predators to keep their victims compliant. Her journey is a profound moral lesson in vulnerability. We learn that true strength does not lie in never getting knocked down, but in having the sheer defiance to stand back up, wipe away the makeup, and expose our scars to the light. Scars are not signs of weakness. They are the map of a survivor. When she tears up her flight ticket to Geneva, she teaches us that we cannot heal by running from the monsters in our lives. We heal by turning around and dismantling their empires. Then, we examine Victor Vance. He flips the traditional archetype of the ruthless mobster on its head, teaching us the true definition of absolute power. Marcus Thorne, the corrupt senator, represents cowardice disguised as authority. A man who uses his fists and fear to control those weaker than him. Victor shows us that real power is rooted in profound restraint. As he wisely states, killing an enemy only costs a bullet, but destroying their legacy with leverage permanently kills the desire for revenge. Victor's restraint reminds us that if we let vengeance swallow our reason, we become the very monsters we seek to destroy. Knowing exactly when to stop is a leader's greatest weapon. Furthermore, the story delivers an uncompromising lesson on loyalty. Loyalty is not the absence of temptation. Every human being feels fear, and everyone has a price. But true loyalty, as we see in the grim fate of the traitor Julian, is facing the abyss and remembering exactly who pulled you out of the mud. It is an unwavering commitment to a core principle, like protecting the helpless, even when a duffel bag of cash is placed on the table. Ultimately, the profound meaning of this story is summarized in its final moments in the autumn garden. It teaches us that the ultimate sanctuary in this brutal world is not built with stolen money or political leverage. True, absolute power is finding that one person brave enough to look at your deepest scars and your ugliest shadows, and instead of walking away, they smile and say, "We will rebuild from here." The narrative presented here is fictional and created for artistic expression. Names, characters, and incidents are either invented or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is unintended and should not be considered factual or deliberate.